On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I'm coming to you from, well, right now my front yard, but most of the footage you're about to see was shot on location in Dallas, Texas. The reason? The crime we're examining in this episode is a 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which occurred on November 22nd. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was being driven in a motorcade through downtown Dallas, Texas. As the motorcade made its way into Elm Street, about 12:30 p.m. Central Time, 3 shots rang out. President Kennedy was mortally wounded. Governor John Connally, who was in the car with the president, was wounded but survived. About 45 minutes later, a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippett, was shot and killed on a Dallas street. The man arrested and charged with all these crimes that afternoon was Lee Harvey Oswald. That was a Friday afternoon. There would be no trial for Lee Harvey Oswald because the following Sunday morning, as he was being led through the police department's basement in Dallas to be transferred to the sheriff's office, he was shot and killed on live television by Jack Ruby, a 52-year-old nightclub owner in Dallas. The tragic and bizarre events of that November weekend in 1963 in Dallas are not only the stuff of history, they are also the stuff of conspiracy theories. No crime in human history has been subject to more conspiracy theories than the Kennedy assassination. As of 2023, over 65% of Americans believe that more people were involved in the assassination of President Kennedy than Lee Harvey Oswald. In this episode, I'll maintain that the theories surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy are just that, theories. And to all but the irredeemable conspiracy theorists, I will suggest that the Warren Commission, who was appointed to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy, got it right, that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby acted alone. One of the interesting but sad facts about the life of President John F. Kennedy is that while many people can remember the date of his death, November 22nd, 1963, but fewer people can remember the date of his birth, May of 1917. This invites a look at the early life and the career of President Kennedy. John Fitzgerald, or Jack Kennedy, was born on May 29, 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second of 8 children born to Joseph Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, among the wealthiest and most well-known Irish Americans of their time. Although Jack Kennedy was beset with health problems even as a youth, when the United States entered World War II in late 1941, he volunteered for the Navy and became a highly decorated PT commander. In 1946, he won election to the U.S. House of Representatives, a post he held until 1952, when he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Jack Kennedy's political resume was enhanced in 1953 when he married Jacqueline Bouvier, a popular, beautiful socialite who became as much of a cultural icon as anyone in the Kennedy family. What was not publicly disclosed during Kennedy's lifetime was his habitual marital infidelity, something that fueled conspiracy theories after his death. The most noteworthy aspect of John F. Kennedy's congressional career was his fight against organized crime, particularly the presence of organized crime in American labor unions. John Kennedy's Senate career witnessed his emergence as much as a celebrity and writer than as a statesman. While he was serving in Congress, Jack Kennedy authored Profiles in Courage, a legacy still honored by his descendants. But he made a name for himself by attacking corruption in American labor unions. Together with his brother Robert, who worked as counsel on the John McClellan Committee investigating corruption of the Teamsters Union, the largest and most corrupt union in the country, Jack and Bobby Kennedy became TV celebrities by grilling some of the most famous mobsters of the day on live television, including Jimmy Hoffa. The Kennedy brothers' war on organized crime would extend into the Kennedy presidency, something that was disquieting to their father Joseph, who had ties to organized crime extending to his bootlegging activity during the Prohibition era of the 1920s. Jack Kennedy was unsuccessful in his bid for the Democratic nomination for vice president in 1956, but his notoriety and his father's fortune brought him the Democratic presidential nomination in 1960. John Kennedy's Republican opponent in the 1960 presidential election was incumbent Vice President Richard Nixon. One of the hallmarks of the 1960 presidential election was the first televised presidential debates, a boon to the candidacy of the photogenic Kennedy. Kennedy, needing help in the South, where many were distrustful of his New England Catholic roots, tagged Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson of Texas as his running mate. 1961 witnessed the beginning of the Kennedy presidency, when the first president born of the 20th century challenged Americans in his inaugural address to ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Thus began the era that later became known as the American Camelot. The 1960 presidential race was close, and one of the battleground states was Illinois. One Kennedy supporter was Sam Giancana, Chicago's most powerful mobster, who allegedly shared a mistress with Jack Kennedy. Her name was Judith Campbell. The alleged ties between the two men and Kennedy's rivalry with other mobsters would generate one of many conspiracy theories. In one of the closest presidential elections in U.S. history, Kennedy carried 49.7% of the popular vote to Nixon's 49.6%. Kennedy carried only 22 of the 50 states in the Electoral College, but won the vote 303 to 219. Jackie Kennedy did not want Americans to remember only her husband's death. Shortly after John Kennedy's death in 1963, Jackie Kennedy told Life magazine that her husband enjoyed listening to the recorded version of the Broadway musical Camelot, a story about the legendary British King Arthur. Camelot became associated with the Kennedy presidency. Jackie Kennedy epitomized glamour and sophistication and was a trendsetter in fashion and grooming. Photos of their children, Caroline and John Jr., or John, romping in the Oval Office delighted Americans. The Kennedy family endured tragedy before and during their time in the White House. Jackie suffered a miscarriage in 1955. In 1956, their daughter Arabella was stillborn. Patrick Kennedy was born prematurely on August 7, 1963, and died 2 days later. Mrs. Kennedy made no public appearances for the next 3 months, when she would accompany her husband on their fateful trip to Dallas. As was the case with most World War II presidents, the defining aspect of the Kennedy presidency, when it came to foreign policy at least, was communism, the Cold War, and the Soviet Union. In particular, President Kennedy's hatred of communism and the fractious relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and Cuba. Two events in particular would give rise to conspiracy theories related to President Kennedy's foreign policy. One was the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. The second was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1960, the final year of the Dwight Eisenhower administration, America's Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, began training a group of Cuban exiles opposed to Cuba's communist government led by Fidel Castro for an invasion of Cuba. The planning continued upon President Kennedy taking office. When the Cuban exiles invaded a southwestern area of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs, it was a disaster, a huge embarrassment for the United States and JFK, and a propaganda victory for Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. In an action that would be unthinkable today when politicians always lay the blame for their mistakes at someone else's feet, Kennedy took full responsibility for the fiasco and publicly stated, "Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." The Bay of Pigs fiasco and clandestine attempts to kill Castro would fuel conspiracy theories that Cuba was behind the assassination of President Kennedy. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane captured photographs of missile installations in Cuba. President Kennedy had three options. 1. Negotiate with Cuba and the Soviet Union. 2. Attack the installation, which might kill hundreds of Soviet and Cuban personnel and lead to all-out nuclear war. Or 3. Impose a naval quarantine against Cuba. President Kennedy chose the third option. Although it was really a blockade, the administration called it a quarantine since a blockade is an act of war. On October 22nd, President Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address about the situation in Cuba. On October 28th, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev informed the president that the missiles in Cuba would be removed. In the eyes of the United States, Kennedy had emerged as victorious over the loud, blustery Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and the hated Soviet Union. Most historians agree that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. But Kennedy had made enemies in the Soviet government. This would fuel conspiracy theories that the Soviets had played a part in his assassination, even though Kennedy's predecessors and successors also held communism, the Soviet Union, and Cuba in contempt. And the Soviet and Cuban governments gained nothing by having Kennedy replaced by Lyndon Johnson, also an ardent foe of communism. Now that we've addressed the career of President Kennedy before his presidency and during his presidency, we shift now to Dallas, Texas, the scene of the Kennedy assassination. There were concerns about President Kennedy's safety before coming to Texas. After all, Texas was a very conservative state, and President Kennedy's civil rights legislation had alienated many Southern voters. 1 month prior to his arrival in Texas, Democratic strategist Adlai Stevenson was assaulted by a group of right-wingers in Texas, and that increased concerns about President Kennedy's security. On November 19, 1963, the public was informed that the president would be visiting Texas and that he would visit the Dallas Trade Mart around 1 p.m. after being driven through downtown Dallas. On November 22nd, President Kennedy delivered a speech in Fort Worth before making the 13-minute flight to Love Field in Dallas, arriving at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. The Kennedys spent several minutes shaking hands before getting into their limousine to head downtown toward the Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to speak. It was a speech he would never make. President Kennedy's fateful Dallas journey began at Love Field. It was there that his motorcade proceeded through downtown Dallas, and somewhat to the surprise of Kennedy aides and Kennedy himself, he was greeted very warmly. There were a few isolated protests, but the crowd overall was very friendly. The trip to Dallas was not President Kennedy's only stop in Texas in November of 1963. He had made stops in Houston, San Antonio, and then made a 10-minute flight from Fort Worth to Dallas on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. In a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, White House aide Kenneth O'Donnell recommended that the president ride open air through downtown Dallas to greet the crowds. Although the press was accompanying the president, no one was assigned to film the president's limousine as it passed through downtown Dallas. As the limo and the other cars in the motorcade, one of which contained Vice President Lyndon Johnson, made its way through Dallas, President and Mrs. Kennedy rode in the back seat. The middle or jump seat was occupied by Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. In the front seat were Secret Service agents Roy Kellerman and the driver William Greer. As the presidential limo turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street, Nellie Connally turned to President Kennedy and said to the president, "Mr. President, you can't say Texas doesn't love you." To which President Kennedy replied something to the effect, "You are correct," or "You're right." Those are the last words spoken to or by President Kennedy. President Kennedy's motorcade made its way through downtown Dallas and then turned onto Houston Street, which is behind me here, at a place called Dealey Plaza, again, right here behind me. It had to make a very sharp left turn onto Elm Street just to my right. And that forced the motorcade, which was already going very slow to begin with, to go even slower. Behind me here at Dealey Plaza is a building which used to be known as the Texas School Book Depository. It overlooks that sharp turn from Houston to Elm Street. That was where the killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, positioned himself on the 6th floor. He had a wide open shot at President Kennedy's limo as it passed down Elm Street to my right and behind me. As the crowd here at Dealey Plaza awaited the presidential motorcade, a few witnesses reported seeing someone holding a rifle on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But those witnesses assumed that the person they saw was either in law enforcement or with the Secret Service, so no one said anything. As soon as the presidential motorcade passed by the Texas School Book Depository at 12:30 p.m., a shot rang out. That shot hit no one, but it struck a culvert and a piece of debris came up and caused a minor injury to a spectator. The second shot, which was marked with an X here on Elm Street, struck President Kennedy in the back of the neck, exited his body, went through the seat in front of him, and struck Governor John Connally. John Connally was struck in the back, the bullet exited his body as well, went through his wrist, and then lodged in his thigh. When President Kennedy was hit with the second shot, he raised his arms towards his throat in a defensive manner of some sort, and you can also see Governor John Connally wince in pain as the bullet strikes him. Governor Connally's wife and President Kennedy's wife at that time turned to their husbands and realized they had been shot. There were several key mistakes in the protection of President Kennedy that afternoon. First was allowing him to ride in an open-air limo. But such a situation was practically unprecedented, so it's easy to have hindsight and judge the actions of those involved. Secondly, after the first shot rang out, the Secret Service agent who was driving the presidential limo failed to take evasive action or failed to speed up, making the assassin's job much easier. The third shot struck President Kennedy, causing his head to practically explode. 3 shots, and only 3 shots, were fired in 8 seconds. As Mrs. Kennedy climbed the back of the presidential limo, trying to retrieve pieces of her husband's head, 31-year-old Secret Service agent Clint Hill, about 2 cars back in the motorcade, exited his limo, climbed atop the presidential limo, pushed Mrs. Kennedy back into her seat, and then covered President Kennedy's body with his own. After Secret Service agent Clint Hill jumped inside the presidential limousine, the limousine sped off under this underpass you see behind me here toward Parkland Hospital, where the president was pronounced dead a short time later. Texas Governor John Connally recovered from his wounds. As the president's limo sped toward Parkland Hospital, about 4 miles away, Governor Connally exclaimed, "They're going to kill us both." President Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Central Time. Governor Connally survived. Dealey Plaza erupted in panic, as one might guess. Many people simply ducked for cover, some ran, but no one knew where to run. Most witnesses reported thinking or hearing or seeing that the shots came from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Some employees of the building on the 5th floor said they heard the shots ring out above them and heard the casings drop to the floor. A Dallas police officer, after hearing those reports, goes inside the Texas School Book Depository. He summons the manager of the business, and the first person they encounter is Lee Harvey Oswald. Thinking it somehow impossible that one of his employees did this, the Texas School Book Depository manager said, "Oh, that's okay, he works here, no problem." And Lee Harvey Oswald left the building. A short time later, the Texas School Book Depository manager rounded up all employees. The only employee missing was Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald had been working at the Texas School Book Depository for about 6 weeks upon the recommendation of a friend named Ruth Payne, with whom his estranged wife was living at the time. But it was too late to catch Lee Harvey Oswald. He had left the building, returned to his boarding house on Beckley Street a few blocks from here, where his killing continued. After he fired the shots that killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connally, Lee Harvey Oswald left the Texas School Book Depository, came here across the street on Beckley Street to his boarding house where he was staying. At the time, he was separated from his wife. Now, for those who suggested Lee Harvey Oswald was part of a larger plot, they failed to mention the fact that whoever helped him out devised a very poor escape plan. Rather than trying to leave the city or leave the country, Oswald returned to his home. But his killing spree was not over that day. Police put out an alert for a white male about 30 years old, 5 foot 10 inches tall, and about 160 pounds. Lee Harvey Oswald had taken a bus to his boarding house on North Beckley Avenue in Dallas. He stayed at this boarding house for a few minutes and then started walking down Beckley Avenue. When Oswald reached East 10th Street and Patton Avenue, he was confronted by a Dallas police officer, 39-year-old J.D. Tippett, an 11-year veteran. Tippett motioned Oswald to his car and exited the police car. Before Tippett could act, Oswald pulled his pistol and shot Tippett 3 times. As Tippett lay on the street, Oswald fired a 4th shot into his head. There were 9 eyewitnesses to the shooting. The murder of Officer Tippett occurred 45 minutes after President Kennedy and Governor Connally were shot. After Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed Officer J.D. Tippett, he continued walking a few more blocks until he got to the Texas Theater across the street from me. Now, police were on the search for a killer, or 2 killers actually, or they thought there were 2 killers, for the killers of President Kennedy and the wounding of Governor Connally and the killing of Officer Tippett. In this case, they thought they were hot on the trail of the man who killed Officer Tippett. An employee at a nearby business reported seeing a man that fit Oswald's description going into the Texas Theater without stopping to pay admission. So police officers entered the Texas Theater, confronted Oswald, who jumped up and said, "This is it," struck one of the officers. A struggle ensued, and Lee Harvey Oswald was taken into custody. It was then that they determined he not only shot and killed Officer J.D. Tippett, but he was also charged with the murders of President Kennedy and the wounding of Governor John Connally. Meanwhile, back at Dealey Plaza, police officers went to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. They found 3 shell casings and a 6.5 millimeter Carcano Model 9138 rifle, or a Mannlicher Carcano, a crude but high-powered Italian rifle, hidden behind one of the thousands of boxes on the 6th floor. What followed the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald that Friday afternoon was utter chaos and an absolute media feeding frenzy. Journalists and observers roamed the halls of Dallas Police Headquarters freely and were even allowed to publicly question Oswald, who was clearly relishing the spotlight. Partnering with the media would encourage cooperation, or so police thought. When asked if he killed the president, Oswald replied that he had not been charged with that and that they were questioning him about the murder of a police officer. Oswald complained of not being allowed legal representation and at one point shouted, "I'm just a patsy." That comment would give rise to conspiracy theories suggesting Oswald did not act alone. In order to understand what led Lee Harvey Oswald to this point and why he was enjoying such an unenviable spot, one has to take a look at the sad, lonely life of Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was born October 18, 1939 in New Orleans, Louisiana. The Oswald family moved frequently, and Lee Oswald attended over 20 schools without graduating from high school. He was raised by his mother and stepfather, and according to his older brother Robert, their mother did not hide the fact that her 3 sons were a burden to her. In Robert's words, Lee was a lonely boy who spent his life in search of the attention and love he could not get at home from his family. He never formed close attachments and never seemed to find a niche. He had delusions of grandeur and was lonely and constantly in search of attention. The family returned to New Orleans, then to Fort Worth, where Lee Oswald quit school for good and joined the Marine Corps in 1956. Lee Harvey Oswald's fascination with communism began when he was about 15. According to his brother Robert, Lee became fascinated with communism because he wanted the attention being different would bring. As a Marine, Oswald became a radio operator and taught himself Russian. Oswald's espousal of communist ideas made him many enemies in the Marine Corps. He was court-martialed twice, once for accidentally shooting himself with an unauthorized weapon and a second time for fighting with a superior. He left the Marines in September 1959 at age 19, lying to the Marines by saying that his family needed him, but instead was intent on defecting to the Soviet Union. Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and said that he wanted to renounce his American citizenship and that he affirmed his allegiance to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Oswald's defection attempt made the news in the United States briefly. The fact that Oswald was a devout communist and had lived in the Soviet Union fueled conspiracy theories. The Soviet Union's chief espionage agency, the KGB, considered enlisting Oswald as he bragged that they would find his experience as a Marine Corps radar operator useful. But the KGB had realized that the 20-year-old Oswald would be useless to them, that he was a nobody, a misfit. The Soviet Union refused his citizenship request and ordered him deported. In a desperate attempt to change the minds of Soviet officials, Oswald slashed his wrists in an apparent suicide attempt. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union acceded to his request, but far from enlisting him as a spy, he was sent to Minsk in Belarus to work in an electronics factory. Tired of the blandness of everyday life as an anonymous factory worker, he requested that the U.S. Embassy return his passport and return to the United States, accompanied by his Russian wife, Marina. Thus began the last year of Lee Harvey Oswald's sad, pathetic, lonely life. According to his brother Robert, when Lee Oswald arrived in Dallas in June 1962, he was chagrined that the media was not there to greet him. He had even prepared some remarks for a press conference. For the remaining 17 months of his life, Lee Harvey Oswald would embark on his own pathetic odyssey. An inkling of his drift into deadly behavior is evidenced by his ordering a .38 caliber pistol in January 1963. Oswald, using the name A. Heidel, also received a rifle by a mail order from Chicago, a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano model 9138. On March 31, 1963, Lee asked his wife Marina to take a photo of him dressed in black, holding the rifle with the pistol visible on his right hip, the weapons used to kill President Kennedy and Officer Tippit. His many faults and lack of accomplishments notwithstanding, no one knew Lee Harvey Oswald was dangerous. He was just another sad, pathetic loner whose marriage was falling apart because of his physical abuse. He had no jobs, few friends, no prospects, and really not much of a future. But his life took a deadly turn with the attempted assassination of General Edwin Walker. Edwin Walker was a 53-year-old Texas native and retired Army general, a staunch anti-communist and ardent segregationist who resigned his Army commission because of his white supremacist views. His minions had assaulted UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson in Dallas in October 1963. The night of April 10th, 1963, a rifle shot was fired at Walker through his kitchen window, but it missed him after being deflected by a window pane. Lee Harvey Oswald told Marina that he was the man who shot at Walker, but she told no one. Oswald hid his rifle in the garage of the house of a woman named Ruth Payne, but she never knew it was there. Ruth Payne was interested in Russian culture and allowed Marina Oswald to stay with her when she and Lee separated. The story appeared in Dallas news circles the next day. The fact that it was Oswald who shot at Walker would not be discovered until after the Kennedy assassination. The next stop in Oswald's odyssey was a return to his birthplace, New Orleans. While working briefly at a coffee company, Oswald started the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which consisted of one person, Lee Harvey Oswald. With 1,000 handbills that he ordered, Oswald was filmed on the streets of New Orleans handing out FPCC flyers and was arrested for scuffling with anti-Castro Cuban exiles in New Orleans. Local news sources covered the event and interviewed him on television, where he admitted being a Marxist. But the attention was fleeting. After New Orleans fizzled, Oswald went to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City in late September to apply for a visa to enter Cuba. He returned to Dallas, arriving in early October and taking a room at a boarding house on North Bleckley Street under an assumed name, while his wife was still living with Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne arranged a job for Oswald at the Texas School Book Depository. Because of his activities in New Orleans and because he had lived in the Soviet Union, Oswald was on the FBI's radar, but he was still not considered dangerous and thus not a high priority.
While most assassins depicted in TV and movies take weeks, months, even years to plot an assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald's plot to assassinate President Kennedy was practically spontaneous.
The exact moment when Lee Harvey Oswald decided to kill President Kennedy is not known. He may have decided the night of November 21st after an argument with Marina. He spent that night at the house of Ruth Payne. He arose early November 22nd. He went to the garage and retrieved the rifle he used against General Walker and wrapped it in paper. As he entered the Texas School Book Depository, he told fellow employees that he was carrying curtain rods. That afternoon, he killed President Kennedy, wounded Governor Connally, killed Officer Tippit, and was taken into custody, where he denied involvement in either of the shootings, claiming he was being questioned because he had once lived in the Soviet Union. Oswald would never go to trial. In fact, he would not leave Dallas Police Headquarters alive.
Lee Harvey Oswald would not only make history as the man who was accused of killing President Kennedy, he would also make history as the first man to be murdered on live television.
The Dallas Police Department publicly announced that Lee Harvey Oswald would be transferred to the Dallas County Jail on Sunday morning, November 24th. Dallas Police Headquarters had received a deluge of death threats against Oswald. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover reported news of threats as well. Dallas police made no effort to conceal Oswald. They invited the media to film the transfer on live television. Jim Lovell, the Dallas police officer who was handcuffed Oswald as they made their way to the garage, told Oswald that he hoped that if anyone decided to take a shot at Oswald, Lovell jokingly said that he hoped they were as good a shot as Lee, meaning that he hoped that a shooter would hit Oswald, not Lovell. Oswald replied, nobody's going to shoot at me. Those may have been the last words Oswald ever spoke. As a smirking Lee Harvey Oswald and Detective Lovell exited the elevator and headed toward the transfer van, a man named Jack Ruby rushed forward with a .38 caliber Colt Cobra and shot Oswald in the stomach at point-blank range. Oswald screamed and fell to the floor, still handcuffed to Detective Lovell, while dozens of officers swarmed the gunman. Although the wound was most likely fatal anyway, whatever chance Oswald had of surviving were dashed by a feckless first-aid attempt. Oswald died at Parkland Hospital.
Now the federal government and Dallas law enforcement had yet another murder to investigate. So who was Jack Ruby, and why did he kill Lee Harvey Oswald?
Police knew Jack Ruby well, and no one was surprised at his rash decision. Jack Ruby, aged 52, was a local strip club operator. He was also a frequent visitor to the Dallas Police Department, feeling the need to stay in their good graces, given that the nature of his business, a strip club owner, might invite unwanted attention from law enforcement. That Sunday was not Ruby's first appearance at the department that weekend. Over the weekend, he was in the department carrying his loaded .38 while Oswald was being moved around headquarters, even interjecting during a press conference with the DA. Over the weekend, he repeatedly expressed his anger, how President Kennedy's children had lost their father, and how Mrs. Kennedy should not have to return to Dallas to testify at Oswald's trial. He told several people, "If I get the chance, I'm going to kill the son of a bitch." On Sunday morning, he received a request from one of his employees, a stripper, to wire her $25 from the Western Union office located a few blocks from Dallas headquarters. Ruby obliged and told her that he was going downtown anyway, leaving questions as to whether his killing of Oswald was premeditated or strictly impulsive. At 11:17 a.m., Ruby completed his Western Union transaction. He had taken his dog with him and left her in the car. Ruby entered the basement about an hour after Oswald's announced transfer time. Detectives had questioned him during that time, so the transfer was delayed. Ruby had taken amphetamines, elevating his already agitated state, and seeing Oswald smirk as he was paraded before television cameras was simply too much. Upon shooting Oswald and being wrestled to the ground, Ruby said, "You killed the president, you rat," and told police, "I'm Jack Ruby. You all know me." Jacob Leon Rubenstein was born April 25, 1911 in Chicago, the fifth of 10 children born to Joseph and Fanny Rubenstein, lower-class immigrant Jews from Poland. Ruby's shady past, especially given that he hailed from Chicago, the organized crime capital of America, led conspiracy theorists to allege that he was working for the mob when he shot Lee Oswald. But those who knew Ruby recall such suggestions ludicrous, saying that if Jack Ruby had a secret, he would tell it. He acquired the nickname Sparky because of his volcanic temper. In 1947, Jacob Rubenstein moved to Dallas and changed his name to Jack Ruby. Everyone who knew Ruby knew him basically as a nice guy, but with a violent temper. That he would bodily remove an unruly customer without any warning. He may have inherited mental illness from his mother. Ruby was tried for the murder of Lee Oswald, and on March 14, 1964, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His murder conviction was overturned in 1966. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Ruby's confession should not have been admitted to evidence and that the trial should have been moved away from Dallas County. While he was awaiting retrial, Ruby died in prison on January 3, 1967 from lung cancer at age 55. Even as he was dying from cancer, Ruby never wavered from his original story. He was acting alone when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Now what? President Kennedy had been assassinated, and his accused assassin had been murdered and silenced as well. The public demanded answers, but there would be no trial. So the job of figuring out what happened that weekend fell to Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon Johnson, who not only faced enormous pressure to give the public answers, but who was about to face an election in his own right the following year.
Knowing that the public and Congress wanted answers, President Johnson created a bipartisan commission, which included an even mix of Democrats and Republicans from both houses of Congress from a cross-section of the country, plus 2 senior statesmen. The commission was chaired by Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. One member was Michigan Congressman and future President Gerald Ford. Surely the public would trust the work of a blue-ribbon bipartisan body of distinguished statesmen. This hope would be a false one. The president pressured the commission to complete its investigation before the 1964 presidential election in November. J. Lee Rankin served as chief counsel, and most of the actual work of the investigation was done by several dozen lawyers and investigators, including future U.S. Senator Arlen Specter and future Transportation Secretary William Coleman. On September 24, 1964, Chief Justice Warren presented President Johnson with an 888-page report in which they concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and Officer Tippit, that he acted alone, and that Jack Ruby acted alone when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. The public was unconvinced, and the JFK assassination generated a cottage industry of conspiracy theories, some plausible and some asinine.
As strange as it might seem today, although the press was covering President Kennedy's visit and some were in the motorcade, no one was assigned to film the president's motorcade as it passed by. So, the assassination was not caught on camera by anyone except one man. That man was Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas businessman, Ukrainian immigrant, whose business was just up the street. He was a dressmaker. He closed his business during lunch so he and his employees could come out and take some pictures of the president. At the time, he had a very primitive home movie camera
which was the only type of camera available in those days to lay people, and he stood at the point you're seeing right now. This was his vantage point of the Kennedy assassination as it goes by. Somehow, despite the panic and despite his own nervousness, he was able to capture the two shots that killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connally as it came by. The Zapruder film is the only video evidence of the Kennedy assassination, and it was taken right here.
But nothing would calm the conspiracy theorist. So in the mid-1970s, Congress took action.
In 1976, the House of Representatives convened a special committee to reinvestigate the assassination of President Kennedy and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The committee was nearly at an end with no evidence of a conspiracy to report when at the last minute, a research firm produced so-called acoustics evidence that a fourth shot had been fired at Dealey Plaza and that it had come from the grassy knoll overlooking the motorcade. The committee concluded that the president was, quote, probably killed because of a conspiracy, resting their conclusion based solely on the so-called acoustics evidence. That evidence will be addressed later in the podcast. In 2003, the 40th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, an ABC News documentary titled The Kennedy Assassination Beyond Conspiracy debunked the conspiracy theories around the assassination and affirmed the findings of the Warren Commission, that both Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby acted alone. In 2007, former Los Angeles prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi released a 1,600-page book on the Kennedy assassination, again affirming the conclusions of the Warren Commission. Some conspiracy theories are somewhat reasonable, while others can only come from the minds of people who are irredeemable conspiracy theorists beyond the pale of reason. These include the theories that Kennedy's Secret Service agents killed him, either intentionally or unintentionally, in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses, and other wild theories. Most of the conspiracy theories are far more complex and contorted than the official explanation, and they do not hold up under scrutiny. Two very simple factors should be noted. One was a last-minute decision to ride in an open-air limousine upon the recommendation of Kennedy aide Kenneth O'Donnell. This last-minute decision was made because at the last minute the weather cleared and it turned from a cloudy, rainy day to a sunny, pleasant day. Another fateful decision that may have cost the president his life was his refusal to allow Secret Service agents to stand on the running boards of his car, as they would obstruct his and the public's view. Had an agent been on the running board, Oswald would not have had a clear shot. Family members of the assassins were divided. Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Marguerite, and his wife, Marina, argued that Lee was innocent, a claim that even many conspiracy theorists did not accept. Lee Oswald's brother, Robert, staunchly argued for the last 5 decades of his life that his younger brother was guilty and that he acted alone. Jack Ruby's brother, Earl, denied that his brother was working for anyone else. Starting first with the fact that President Kennedy had many enemies and many people that hated him enough to want him dead. But that does not make him different than any other president. Although some of these theories have some level of plausibility, and conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination are espoused by more than the typical delusional conspiracy theorists, they all suffer from two fundamental flaws. One, while the official investigation is not perfect, it is much more plausible than the complex conspiracy theories. Had President Johnson acted on any of these conspiracy theories, the same group of theorists would have argued that he accepted a preposterous conspiracy theory when the simple explanation that Oswald and Ruby acted alone was the most obvious. Two, they simply overlook actual evidence and circumstances offered by the Warren Commission in favor of convoluted theories as to why it may have happened. In this segment, I address some of those theories and refute them one by one. People can devise all the theories and motives they want, but this event only happened one way, the way described by the Warren Commission.
Was the photo of Lee Harvey Oswald holding the weapons doctored?
To my professorial friend here, the answer is no. The photo was examined by experts from several countries and determined to be authentic.
No rifle was strong enough to do the damage done by the second shot.
I love the Pop Cup, but I have to disagree with you. The Italian-made rifle that Oswald used was crude but powerful and capable of striking a target at least 200 yards away, over twice the distance of the 88 yards between Oswald and President Kennedy.
So I understand you have a question about the Kennedy assassination. What was it?
So I want to know if Lee Harvey Oswald was competent enough to make that shot from that location and that distance.
Let me ask you one more thing. Well, two more things, actually. Did you ever serve in the military?
I did.
What branch?
I was in the Marine Corps.
Well, as a Marine, you know that Oswald was competent. Hard copy evidence of Oswald's qualifying examinations showed that he was eminently capable of striking a slowly moving target at a range far beyond the 88 yards between him and the president. He scored 212 in the Marine Corps, qualifying him as a sharpshooter, hitting targets 200 yards away, more than twice the distance between him and Kennedy in 1963. Initial erroneous reports that the 3 shots were fired in 6 seconds contributed to this idea, but the shots were fired over a span of 8 seconds, ample time to fire 3 shots.
The second shot that struck President Kennedy in the back of the neck and then struck Governor Connally took an impossible route. It exited the front of Kennedy's body, paused in midair, took a turn, and then went through the seat to strike Governor Connally. Now, unless Magneto was there, that's one magic bullet.
With sincere apologies to Magneto, proponents of the magic bullet theory had the alignment of Kennedy and Connally wrong. Governor Connally was not seated directly in front of the president. He was seated slightly lower and to the left, creating a direct path for the second shot. It was not a magic bullet at all, and it is not a single bullet theory, it is a single bullet fact.
Supposedly, the bullet that struck both men, Kennedy and Connally, was found at the hospital beside the gurney that the governor was on. It was in pristine condition, and therefore it could not have been the bullet that struck both of them.
First off, is that chick hot or what? If you are unattached, please message me. She is gorgeous but wrong. The bullet that struck both men was not pristine at all, but was heavily damaged.
Now, if Kennedy was shot from behind, why did his head go back into the left?
That distinguished gentleman who has the air of a creative writer should consider writing his next book on this event. The third and fatal shot forced the president's head to jerk back into the left, which according to conspiracy theorists points to a second shooter who was in front of, not behind the president. But the fact is this: autopsy results and slowed down viewing of the Zapruder film indicate that the third shot did indeed come from behind, and that Kennedy's jerk of the head back into the left does not mean the shot came from in front.
What about the acoustic evidence that shows there was a fourth shot?
This hardcore Buffalo Bills fan is a forensics expert, and he asked this question because he knows there are flaws with this idea. This assumption rests on acoustics experiments highlighted in the House Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s. It maintains that H.B. McLean, a Dallas motorcycle officer who was in the motorcade, accidentally left his radio microphone in the on position, which recorded a fourth shot, and that Officer McLean was only a few hundred feet behind the president at the time. But the fact is this: the pseudoscience employed in the 1970s was discredited shortly after the House Committee concluded its work. In the 1970s and again in 2003, Officer McLean, who never had an incentive to lie, maintained that his microphone was not left in the on position. Plus, he was half a block away from where he would have needed to be for the allegation to have merit.
The Cuban dictator, Fidel Castro, ordered the Kennedy assassination.
Leave it to my girl Lisette to say it in style, but sorry to say she is wrong here. Conspiracy theorists point to Castro's threats against American political leadership and to the fact that Oswald was an unapologetic critic of U.S. policy toward Cuba. Supposedly, President Johnson, while publicly voicing support for the Warren Commission findings, privately harbored the suspicion that Castro was behind the assassination. One of the faults with the Warren report was its omission of the attempts the Kennedy administration was making to remove Castro. Remarks made by Castro in September 1963 suggest that he was considering an attempt against American leaders in revenge of the Bay of Pigs invasion and clandestine CIA attempts to kill him. In the 1970s, Fidel Castro told Robert Blakey, the lawyer for the House Committee investigating the assassination, that killing Kennedy would have triggered a U.S. invasion of Cuba, the very thing he wanted to avoid. Getting Kennedy out of his way would not have helped Castro. Lyndon Johnson despised his regime as much as Kennedy did. Changing presidential administrations did nothing to help him. Oswald made efforts to visit Cuba, but the Cubans wanted no part of it.
Lee Harvey Oswald lived in the Soviet Union and was a devout Marxist. What if he worked with the Soviet Union? He may have been asked to kill the President of the United States. That's something to think about, you know?
So many great thoughts come to mind when we are enjoying our coffee, but I have to rebut this one. The Soviet Union wanted no part of Lee Harvey Oswald, who was deemed too young, too eager, too much of a misfit, and not smart enough to work for the KGB, and the country did not even want him living there. Such a plan would have been too obvious. Interviews with former KGB officials support this idea.
Jack Ruby was a mafia hitman. Look, I live in Chicago. I know a thing or two about organized crime.
First off, is it just me, or does this fellow look like NFL quarterback Sam Hartman? What a great video with the beautiful Chicago River and our favorite corn cob skyscrapers in the background, and a virtual fist bump on the perfect beard. But the answer here is no. Even though some reasonable people agree with you, and there are some connections between the Windy City and the JFK assassination. JFK shared a mistress with Chicago mobster Sam Giancana, and in addition to the apparent possibility that someone was trying to silence Oswald, much has been made of the idea that Jack Ruby did not seem enough of a red-blooded patriot to do what he did, that he lived a life of petty crime and on the margins of respectability, and that he had roots in Chicago made him even more suspect. G. Robert Blakey believed that Kennedy was killed by organized crime. Blakey had a long history of combating organized crime. He worked on Attorney General Robert Kennedy's organized crime task forces and wrote the RICO, or the first law that attacked organized crime, Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Law. It should not be surprising that he would see organized crime as a culprit, but his assumptions were refuted by other organized crime experts. Those who knew Jack Ruby were not surprised at what he did because of his violent temper, which possibly crossed the lines into mental illness, something he may have inherited from his mother. Ruby's actions that morning do not support the conspiracy assertion. He arrived at Dallas Police Headquarters 1 hour after Oswald's publicized transfer time and just happened to walk in at the right time. Those who knew him stated that if Jack Ruby had a secret, he would tell it. According to Ralph Salerno, another organized crime expert who worked with Robert Blakey, if Ruby was sent to silence Oswald, someone would need to silence Ruby, and that did not happen. The fact that he lived in prison for 3 years after the murder and never changed his story, even on his deathbed, refutes the notion that Ruby was a professional hitman.
The poor protection by the Dallas Police Department raises some questions.
This retired police officer is correct. It does raise questions. Some believe the poor protection provided by the Dallas police is evidence of their complicity, but such an action would require the complicity of dozens of Dallas police officers. Although the security that they provided was atrocious, in its defense, very few police departments, even large ones, were equipped to handle the avalanche of attention and media presence that came the weekend of November 22nd, 1963.
Did the Warren Commission collude to hide the truth?
First off, hola to this outstanding spin and cycle instructor, but the answer to your question is no. While there are some justifiable criticisms of the Warren Commission's investigation, the notion that so many high-level officials from varying political backgrounds, some of whom were barely on speaking terms, worked together to suppress the truth is far-fetched. Most of the actual investigative work was performed by assistants. One of those young lawyers named Bert Griffin stated that he was eager to find evidence of a conspiracy, as doing so would have aided his political career, but nothing was to be found. Another Warren Commission lawyer, William Coleman, correctly stated that no one has come forth with any conclusive evidence supporting another version of the events, and that if there is some secret evidence the government has been hiding since 1963, someone would have made a name for themselves by making it public.
Hello, Mark, it's Keone. Question, because I've argued with people about this a lot. The statement of President Kennedy's murder was ordered by Lyndon B. Johnson in collusion with the CIA and the military-industrial complex, who wanted to ramp up American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. What do we say about that statement?
I saved the most bizarre conspiracy idea for last, and thanks to the one and only Keone Stevens for pitching in here. This theory is tied to the work of Jim Garrison, a corrupt New Orleans prosecutor who had a local businessman named Clay Shaw tried for the Kennedy assassination in 1969. Garrison conducted a sham trial accusing Shaw of being the linchpin in a conspiracy that included several teams of assassins, the CIA, FBI, Defense Department, President Lyndon Johnson, President Richard Nixon, the Dallas Police Department, and organized crime. A plot that would include hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people, all of whom were able to keep the matter secret over several decades. Garrison vowed to obtain many convictions because he was sure beyond a shadow of a doubt of what occurred. In January of 1969, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, normally devoted to lighter topics, devoted an entire hour to an interview with Garrison. While simultaneously arguing that he was not proclaiming Shaw guilty, but also guaranteeing a conviction in the case, Garrison made his case for CIA and Johnson's involvement. The normally apolitical Carson flatly stated that he was not convinced. In 1969, a New Orleans jury acquitted Shaw after less than an hour of deliberations. The Garrison-Shaw case was brought out of well-deserved obscurity in the early 1990s, when film director Oliver Stone recreated the story in the film JFK, depicting the corrupt and ruthless Garrison portrayed by Kevin Costner as a hero. Stone, whose attitudes toward the American government were shaped or warped by his experiences as a decorated soldier in the Vietnam War, did not accept the official version of the Kennedy assassination, so he created a counter-myth of his own. His skills as a director are on full display, as is some great acting by an all-star Hollywood cast, save for Kevin Costner's embarrassing attempt at a Southern accent. Garrison was given a small cameo role as Chief Justice Earl Warren. Of all the conspiracy theories that have been dumped into the public mainstream, this one is the most ludicrous. The JFK film, which Johnson aide Jack Valenti called a package of lies, is farcically inaccurate, and the faults are too numerous to name. A personal side note, I had a relative by marriage who was distantly related to Jim Garrison. When Garrison died in 1992, his own family members stated that he was so crooked that he had to be screwed into the ground. All Americans old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination can remember what they were doing and where they were when they heard the news of his murder. And many Americans who were not even alive at the time of the assassination have read and heard about it their entire lives. If the murder of John F. Kennedy marked the end of violence and unrest in the 1960s and an end to the Cold War, the story would be sad enough. Unfortunately, it was only the beginning of one of the most turbulent decades in the nation's history, marked by the Vietnam War, riots, social unrest, and other high-profile assassinations, including the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and President Kennedy's brother Robert. And it was a murder that will continue to interest Americans for generations to come. A big thank you to those who participated in the podcast, and as a reminder, the views expressed were not their own. They were acting the part as a favor to yours truly. Thanks again. And don't forget to check out my new book, A History of the United States Through High-Profile Assassinations, published by Cognella Press.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.